Welcome, dear listeners and viewers, to the next episode of my series. As usual, I will start by showing you an overview of the series. In today's episode, I will not open a new section of topics. We will remain in the second section, which is dedicated to the theory of internal emotional wounds. So today we will follow up on the previous one and show you one specific example and story of one wound, the wound of abandonment. But I must warn you in advance that today's episode will be somewhat dark. It's because we will show the wound of abandonment in the story of the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer. I don't intentionally avoid the darkness that surrounds this story, because it cannot be avoided anyway. Darkness does not disappear by avoiding and ignoring it. Just as in the physical world, darkness is dispelled by bringing light into it. The same applies to the spiritual world. But in the spiritual world, it's not enough for us to light the torch or press a switch. In the spiritual world, figurative lighting means that we move the contents of the unconscious into the conscious. And so this dark story, which lies in the collective unconscious due to the societal misunderstanding, must be made conscious. That is, fully understand it, including its roots. And that is what I will aim for today. And first of all, I would like to say that even though this specific story is about one particular wound, this analysis can be applied to other types of wounds as well. Every wound is activated by some external stimulus, and the process inside the person after the activation of the wound is also the same for all types of wounds. Even the manifestations of the wounds are very similar. So this video is not just about one wound. We can also apply the following analysis to all other wounds. First, let's describe the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, in which we will show the wound of abandonment. I would like to point out right away that the aim of this talk is not intended to be objective analysis or diagnosis of this particular story or person. The goal is to demonstrate the manifestation of the wound that I believe this person suffered by using his story. Jeffrey Dahmer was born into a troubled family. While most of the material I've had the opportunity to study goes into a more detailed analysis of his relationship with his father, in my opinion, from a deeper spiritual perspective, Jeffrey's relationship with his mother had a greater impact on him. As I've already mentioned, in my opinion, the greatest driving force behind Jeffrey's actions was the wound of abandonment. And as we already know from the previous second episode, abandonment is a strong feeling that a child perceives in relation to a parent of the opposite sex. So in this particular case, his mother. While at first glance the abnormal tendencies and horrific acts seem to be central to this unfortunate tale, I will attempt to analyze what was going on with Jeffrey Dahmer himself and what led him to harm other human beings. We will try to divert attention from the bizarre urges that Jeffrey Dahmer had and go deeper in the psychological analysis. That is, to search for the real roots and causes of his actions. The court found Jeffrey to be sane, and he himself also pleaded guilty. So what drives a person to such gruesome acts? In my mind, it is one's own pain, the pain stemming from internal wounds, emotional deprivation, and traumatic childhood. And the subsequent acts of violence occur after experiencing the pain of such wounds. As a child, Jeffrey was very emotionally deprived. He felt a severe lack of attention and love, especially from his mother. His mother was probably withdrawn. She suffered from depression and spent most of her time by herself, locked in her own room. This fact causes enormous trauma in child's development and is a breeding ground for the formation of the abandonment wound. The lack of attention from his mother, that is, the parent of the opposite sex, was not the only indicator of abandonment wound. We can notice a recurring pattern of behavior that all of his subsequent actions followed. That is, the departure or abandonment of a person with whom Jeffrey had just established contact. What's important is the realization that a person suffering from abandonment wound perceives even a seemingly ordinary and normal departure of another person as abandonment. The most intense pain that the person suffering from the abandonment wound can experience is the lack or breaking of an emotional attachment to another person. However, we might object by saying that Jeffrey sought out solitude and avoided people. How then is it possible that a loner could suffer from the wound of abandonment, the greatest pain of which is the lack or breaking of emotional bonds? It is precisely because a prolonged lack of these bonds is more acceptable in terms of experiencing the wound. If we understand the process of experiencing the wound, we find that the abandoned person becomes so strongly fixated on another when establishing any relationship that this other person usually feels overwhelmed and leaves the abandoned person because of it. And in this abandonment, the wounded person experiences much higher level of pain than is normally experienced in the moments of prolonged loneliness. And therefore, the person with the deepest desire for an emotional connection prefers to become a loner and suffer stably in long term, but avoiding the sudden, uncontrollable pain of an emotional bond being broken, that is, the activation of the wound. Jeffrey also admitted that he had a compulsion for dominance and control. Again, I believe that this is a personality aspect that developed as a result of an inner wound. Dominance allows one to act against another person's will, which would have allowed Jeffrey to draw the other person to himself, thus preventing a painful departure and the feeling of abandonment. Control can also be a signal of the wound of betrayal and is its typical mask. Control then allows one to anticipate and thus avoid a situation that might potentially be hurtful. Let's show how the process of activating and experiencing wound works. Jeffrey established a relationship with another person, and the moment that the person wanted to leave, which is perfectly normal, in Jeffrey the situation activated the abandonment wound and triggered a huge rush of emotions and pain. When held inside, this pain and pressure is manageable to a certain degree depending on the severity of the wound. Since Jeffrey did what he did, we can assume that his wound was so severe that the pain of experiencing it and the excess pressure that builds up inside the person was unbearable. In extreme cases like this, a person has very limited options, and they actually become a victim of their own wound. The pressure and the pain inside cause the suffering individual to do something. Inside, he experiences unbearable pain and excessive pressure, and both must be directed somewhere. Something has to be done with it, otherwise the pain won't go away. And the only options available are either turning the pain against yourself or against someone else. The biggest problem in this process is when a person is not fully aware of his or her wound. Of course, a person perceives the pain they feel when the wound is activated, but it's very common that they aren't able to link it to the causes of childhood events, as the pain is so overwhelming that it disconnects rationality. There is simply no room for it. At the same time, painful memories and feelings from childhood are pushed out of consciousness by internal mechanisms. This leads to a situation when one is paralyzed by strong painful feelings, but doesn't know what they spring from or what to do about them. This person actually becomes a victim of their own wounds, which come back into his life again and again, and there is no escape from them. The pain is accompanied by strong feelings of helplessness and puzzlement, which, like a cocktail of unpleasant feelings, overwhelm the person and force them to seek some form of relief. The aforementioned increasing pain and excess pressure, which is caused by an activated wound, subsequently forces the person to do something about the situation. As we explained in the previous video on wounds, the most common, easiest, and most intuitive response is projection. In the case we are analyzing, we unfortunately know how this projection finally turned out. The young man who had established some kind of relationship with Jeffrey naturally wanted sooner or later to return home or leave the meeting. But such a perfectly ordinary situation is perceived very differently by the wounded person. Even objectively harmless situations can activate a wound, and even if the situation is practically harmless, the person experiences the same pain as in childhood, regardless of the severity of the current situation. Thus, a process of activating and experiencing the wound takes place inside Jeffrey, consequently activating typical behavioral patterns of a person wounded by abandonment, that is, behavior resulting from the mask of a dependent person, to stay in touch, physically or at least emotionally, at all costs. Jeffrey's inner pain was probably so intense that he chose to deal with it in the unfortunate way that we are all familiar with. I didn't choose this story to shock or show extreme forms of human action. I really choose it only because it best illustrates the wound of abandonment. Jeffrey says it practically everywhere.
Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me.
That was the real motive at the deepest level. And in my opinion, the main goal of psychology should be able to uncover the superficial manifestations and get to the depths. Jeffrey Dahmer simply did not want to experience another abandonment after establishing a new relationship. We can also notice his walk or dropping hands, which perfectly describes the dependent type of person, as described in the book of Lise Bourbeau. I'm convinced that Jeffrey Dahmer felt the abandonment from the first moments of his life, which only deepened during his unhappy childhood. The abandonment feelings were probably so strong that he preferred to withdraw into himself. He withdrew because if he established a relationship with someone, he became attached to them so strongly that the other person left him. If we carry this wound within us, even the word abandonment itself will evoke strong painful feelings in us, especially when we have felt alone since childhood, and then every time we establish contact, that person seemingly abandons us. If we have this predisposition to feel abandoned within ourselves, we perceive every departure of another person as abandonment. Therefore, we experience it practically on a daily basis, and so we prefer to withdraw and suffer alone, long-term, but steadily. And that abandoned little inner child gradually becomes a shadow figure in the form of a monster, because every unfulfilled desire develops into its worst form over time. Many of us carry strong wounds within us, but it doesn't always have to go this far. Only by understanding such stories and what wounds can cause in us, we can learn and integrate the wounds within us, and also integrate it as a story into the collective consciousness of society, so that society can learn and discover why tragic stories like these happen. It's easy to say he's a madman, a psychopath, a deviant. But behind every story like this is a person deeply wounded in the most sensitive places. A man who was abandoned, rejected, and humiliated. Unfortunately, even such extreme stories shows us where we need to go as a society, because every situation, positive or negative, teaches us something. And if we don't come to understand the situation, it will come back again to teach us a lesson. And many other similar sad stories, such as this one for example, confirmed it. So how should I conclude this unfortunate story? The extremity of this story shows the extreme consequences that the strong wound can have in us, and only a wounded man can commit such evil. We are all very different, we have different interests, and our paths may be also very different. But at our core, we all want to be loved, accepted, understood, cared for, and to feel connection with other people. A fundamental deficiency in these basic human needs creates a hole in us in which we then try to fill with anything else that we can. A fundamental deficiency that is some form of wound can then lead to violent behavior towards other people because of the pain it causes. So let's deal with our wounds, pull them out of our unconsciousness, and work with them. Only then can we break the seemingly endless chain of suffering.